Good morning. We're being hit with drone delusions in Europe, and you should be keeping an eye out for false flags. What we're seeing is the strategy of tension being played out at a moment when there's a potential to put an end to the permanent wars that have been foisted upon us by the neocons and the Anglo-Americans. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 29th, 2025. There's been an ongoing battle at the United Nations over the last week around the fight against continued colonial policy directed by the United States and the United Kingdom, using Israel as the enforcer of that colonial policy in Southwest Asia. And while there are many calls to defend the Palestinians from Israeli genocide, there are also calls to reform the United Nations, which are quite significant because the United Nations Security Council has been blocked by U.S. policy, which is to continue to be complicit in the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people. So the problem is that the U.S. veto in the UN Security Council is able to block the will of the majority. And that's why reform is necessary. Maybe increase the new members of the UN Security Council, or to restrict the veto when there's an overwhelming majority in favor of it, or just to move it into the United Nations General Assembly, where there's full support for an independent Palestinian state and condemnation of Israel's policies. There are also really strong statements against colonialism, many of which are emphasizing the importance of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, whose 250th anniversary we celebrate next year, that idea of the all men are created equal and the idea of inalienable rights, that's been called on by the newly sovereign states of the global South to have that extended to them and not limited just to a handful of northern powers. So there's very little reporting on this. And instead, we're being hit with the kind of information warfare that we're used to. Now, this is going to come up today with Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington, D.C. to meet with Trump. And he's going to try and get support from Trump to finish the job in Gaza, which means the final solution against the Palestinians in Gaza, and also put forward the idea of a new plan to strike Iran, asking Trump to not only give a green light to participate, but to participate in such an attack. Now, it's not clear what Trump will do. There's been a certain amount of back and forth from Trump in the last couple of days. On the one hand, he's afraid of losing support for a Zionist Greater Israel, which comes from the Christian Zionists in the United States, as well as from the Zionist lobby, the heavy funding for the support for Israel. But the problem is that the U.S. holds the cards needed to end the genocide in Gaza, and also to end the war in Ukraine. Now, Trump went to Truth Social last week to essentially say he thinks Ukraine can win back the territory taken by Russia, that the European Union and NATO should support the Ukrainians, but there was the way he phrased it was taken by many in Europe, and I think they're correct in this, that he's planning on washing his hands of the whole Ukraine situation, meaning that the fall of Ukraine, which is inevitable, will point to Starmer, Macron, and Merz, and the Europeans for letting it happen. And so there's an ambiguity there, and no one's quite sure where it's going to go. Now, with Israel, Trump did tell the Arab leaders that he met with last week that he would oppose any effort to annex more land in the West Bank by Israel. But Netanyahu's gang of Greater Israel fanatics are insisting that that land is theirs, they have a right to annex it, They're unleashing settlers to carry out violent attacks on the Palestinians. And this is connected, that is the West Bank question, connected to the expulsion of the vast majority of Palestinians who live in Gaza. So these are some issues that are still going to be taken up this week at the United Nations. And as I said, it's not clear where Trump's going to come down on this, because he's come down on both sides, or if possible, on all 3 or 4 sides in the last days. But what he's seeing is the shift away from support for Israel among the United States population, including especially among young Republicans. And so do you attribute this to an upsurge of anti-Semitism, which is what Netanyahu says? Or, as Gideon Levy writes in today's Haaretz, is it possible that the rest of the world is seeing that Netanyahu himself is guilty of genocide, and that the Israeli population has been deluded by the Netanyahu public relations campaign? Now, we see also large demonstrations around the world. There were 60,000 in Berlin on Saturday, and in a number of demonstrations in Italy, up to 500,000 people on the street in defense of the Palestinian independent state. Now, that brings us back to the strategy of tension. I wrote an article on this, which will be appended in the description section, about how the drone sightings fit into this. And this was especially after the Charlie Kirk assassination, the intent being to distract the population from the bigger issues, as well as the solutions to those issues, which have been supported by the Schiller Institute. What's clear is that the population doesn't want a war. In Germany, polls are showing that the German people don't want to fight Russia, and that while they may not like Putin, they don't believe that Putin is about to invade Europe. So they're seeing through the propaganda, especially when it comes down to their future and their children's future. So what's the point of the strategy of tension? It's to direct the attention away from these bigger issues onto the profiled issues of left versus right, woke versus asleep, or unwoke, or whatever the opposite of woke is. I would say sane. But to pit people against each other when it's in the interest of the vast majority to support the development of a new strategic architecture and a new economic development architecture. But that's the effect of hybrid warfare, the deployment of fake news, of fake stories. We see this in terms of Russiagate for many years now. Russiagate's been going on almost for 10 years. One breakthrough on this was the indictment of former FBI Director James Comey. Now, Comey is guilty of lying to Congress. There's no question about that. And so were several others, including the person who replaced him, Christopher Wray, as head of the FBI. What about Brennan? What about Clapper? So Tulsi Gabbard's work is cut out for her to make the old Obama administration team and the Biden team accountable for their crimes. And that should go on, and it should continue. But at the same time, we're seeing from the media and from the so-called pundits, people like John Bolton, who are saying that the United States must take a strong stand against Russian imperial aggression. In reality, it's Bolton who's defending the imperial aggression, which is coming from his masters from the City of London. So we'll see in terms of the situation in Southwest Asia, what happens in the next 24 hours with the Netanyahu meeting with Trump. Will Netanyahu get his way with Trump? Will Trump issue conflicting statements? Or will he demonstrate the leadership, which simply says, Bibi, get your troops out, end the occupation, and establish or support the establishment of a Palestinian state, which offers an opportunity for not only a two-state solution, but for cooperation. Now, the neocons, of course, are basically saying that they're defending the Netanyahu by saying that there was no disagreement between Charlie Kirk when he was assassinated and Netanyahu. I think the story is coming out, though, quite clearly from people like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others who are making it clear that there was a growing distance between the Israel lobby and Charlie Kirk, and that Kirk, while he may have continued to be a supporter of Israel, was not supporting some of the policies of Israel, or more importantly, the policies of the United States to defend Israeli aggression, both in terms of what they were doing in Gaza and in terms of the attacks on Iran. So people should get this straight in their heads to recognize the point of the strategy of tension is to confuse you and disarm you so that you sit back and say nothing can be done. Well, something can be done. Join our mobilization. Get a subscription to the Daily Alert and become active in your community, pointing to the potential for economic policies that will put an end to this permanent war and permanent depression policy